Picture this: a drawing room in the middle of the English countryside, the kind that smells of old money and older grudges. 40 guests, most of them relatives, arranged around a solicitor's reading table, as though they had been placed there deliberately, which, of course, they had. At the head of the table, her uncle, Viscount Harwell, standing with the unhurried confidence of a man who has arranged everything to his satisfaction and knows it, and in the far corner, wearing a housekeeper's gray dress and a borrowed cap that sat slightly too large for her head, stood the woman who owned the house. Her name was Arabella Thornton. She was 26 years old. She had been the rightful heir to Thornfield Park for as long as she had been alive, and for the past 7 months she had been mopping its floors under a false name, waiting. She had not been waiting passively. That distinction mattered. When her uncle stood up and informed the assembled family that the late Earl of Thornfield had, in his final months, revised his will to exclude his only daughter on grounds of temperament and unsuitability for the responsibilities of a great estate, Arabella Thornton set down her polishing cloth very carefully, folded her hands in front of her apron, and listened. She did not react. The room held its breath. 40 people turned, as rooms always turn in such moments, not toward the man speaking, but toward the person most affected, looking for confirmation of the damage done, for the crack in the surface, for the proof that the blow had landed. They saw a housekeeper in a gray dress looking at the floor. None of them recognized her. That had been the point. She walked out of the drawing room at the appropriate moment, collected her cleaning basket from the hall table, and returned to the east wing. And the guests, because they were guests at such an occasion, and this was what guests did at such occasions, began to talk. What they did not know, what none of them knew, was that Arabella had been writing to a solicitor of her own for the past 4 months, and that the solicitor had, the previous Tuesday, sent her a letter that she had read 3 times, and then locked inside the false bottom of her cleaning basket. She was not walking away in defeat. She was walking towards something, and by the time her uncle understood what that meant, it would be far, far too late. Arabella had been 19 when her father first became ill, and 20 when she understood that his illness was going to kill him, and 22 when she understood that there were people in her family who considered his dying an opportunity. Her uncle, Viscount Harwell, her father's younger brother by 11 years, a man whose charm had always sat slightly too close to the surface, like lacquer on cheap furniture, had begun visiting Thornfield Park with increasing frequency once the Earl could no longer leave his rooms with ease. He came with concern in his voice and calculation in his eyes, and Arabella had watched him the way she watched most things, carefully and without comment, because she had learned very early that a woman who says nothing is often underestimated, and underestimation had its uses. Her father had died on a gray Wednesday morning in October, 3 years ago now. He had died holding her hand. He had died after telling her, in the particular voice of a man who has said the important things and is now managing the logistics, that Thornfield was hers, that it had always been meant to be hers, that he had not, unfortunately, been able to prevent certain revisions to the formal documents that had been made in the final weeks of his illness, in a period when Arabella had been in Edinburgh visiting her mother's family, and her uncle had been very present and very helpful. She had come home to a changed will. The revised document was, she was told, entirely legal. Her uncle had engaged 3 solicitors to assure her of this. His tone had been sympathetic. His eyes had been satisfied. She had 2 choices, accept it or fight it. Fighting it through proper channels would cost money she no longer controlled and time, during which her uncle would consolidate everything he had just taken. She had considered this for 4 days, which was longer than most people would have given her credit for enduring. And then she had written to Mr. Aldous Finch. Mr. Finch was her father's oldest friend. He was also, not coincidentally, a retired solicitor of considerable reputation who had handled the Earl's affairs for 30 years before his retirement, and who was, as he put it in his reply, not at all surprised to hear from her and had been expecting it. She had asked him a single question: what would it take to prove the will was made under duress? He had written back a list. The list was specific. At the top of it was documentation from the period of her father's illness. Below that was testimony from anyone present at Thornfield during the final weeks. Below that were financial records showing the pattern of changes made to accounts during that time. All of these things were at Thornfield Park. Arabella had sold 2 pieces of her mother's jewelry, taken what remained of her personal accounts, and hired herself out as a housekeeper under the name Miss Beatrice Marsh, presenting references that Mr. Finch had, through channels she chose not to examine too closely, arranged for her. She had arrived at her own front door on a Monday morning in April, 7 months ago, with a carpet bag and a practiced expression of competent anonymity. The housekeeper who admitted her, Mrs. Quine, who had been at Thornfield for 18 years and who Arabella had known since childhood, had looked at her carefully for a long moment. Something had shifted in the old woman's face. She had asked no questions. She had shown Arabella to the servants' quarters and allocated her the east wing, which was, not coincidentally, the section of the house where all the household records were kept. Mrs. Quine knew. They never discussed it. That was its own kind of loyalty. The east wing at Thornfield was where the house kept its memory. Ledgers going back 40 years, account books, correspondence files, the record of every repair and purchase and transaction that had passed through the estate. Arabella spent her days cleaning the east wing with particular thoroughness, and her evenings reading it. She read the way she had been taught to read by a governess who believed that the point of reading was to understand what the words were actually saying. Not what you hoped they said or feared they said, but what they said, carefully, all the way down. What the records said was this: in the 14 months before her father's death, beginning precisely when her uncle's visits became frequent, a series of transfers had been made from the estate's primary accounts to a secondary fund. The amounts were not enormous individually. Cumulatively, over 14 months, they were significant. The transfers had been authorized by signatures that were, to Arabella's eye, not quite right. Her father's handwriting, yes, but the handwriting of a man under some difficulty. A man, perhaps, who had been persuaded to sign things without being given adequate opportunity to read them first. She copied everything. She copied it by hand in the evenings, with a borrowed pen, her writing small and precise because paper was finite and detail was important. She sealed the copies in a package and addressed it to Mr. Finch. She sent it through the village post on Thursdays when she collected the household mail. She included each week a short letter explaining what she had found and asking for his assessment. He replied, always, within 5 days. His assessments were encouraging without being optimistic, which she had come to understand was his version of warmth. The financial records were one thread. There were others. Dr. Calloway, who had attended her father in his final months, had retired to the village of Atterwick, 12 miles from Thornfield. His attendance at her father's deathbed was a matter of record. What he had witnessed during those final weeks was not. Arabella had written to him twice. He had not replied. She had not expected him to reply by letter. The reading of the will had been her uncle's idea. He had declared it publicly, framed it as a gesture of transparency, invited the extended family and 2 members of the local community who stood to benefit from certain charitable provisions. He had done this, Arabella understood, because he wanted witnesses. He wanted the family to see the situation confirmed. He wanted it to be finished in the most public way possible. This had been, she reflected, a mistake on his part. She had prepared for it with the same methodical attention she gave to everything. She had written to Mr. Finch the previous week with a specific request. She had also, on the Wednesday before the gathering, taken her half-day off and walked the 12 miles to Adderwick. Dr. Calloway answered his own door. He was a small man of perhaps 65, with careful eyes and the particular bearing of someone carrying something uncomfortable. He looked at her for a moment on the doorstep. She was wearing her housekeeper's dress. He had last seen her 3 years ago, at her father's deathbed, when she had been wearing the clothes of an earl's daughter and weeping over the man's hand. He recognized her. She said, without preamble, "Dr. Calloway, I am not here to ask you for anything you are not prepared to give. I am here to let you know that the process of challenging my father's revised will has begun in earnest, and that the financial records from the estate have already been submitted to council. I wanted to give you the opportunity to make a decision about how you would like to participate in what happens next, with full information rather than without it." She had rehearsed those words, not in front of a mirror. She was not that kind of person, but walking the estate early in the mornings, when the house was still quiet, listening to whether the sentences held. They held. The doctor said nothing for a long moment. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. She had tea with him for 2 hours. She walked back to Thornfield in the near dark. She had what she needed, or enough of it, not everything, but enough. The day after the will reading, her uncle came to inspect the East Wing. He came in the way of men who have recently won something and are conducting a tour of their victory. He had brought with him the estate manager, a man named Croft, who was his appointment rather than her father's, and who walked half a step behind Harwell with the particular attentiveness of someone employed to confirm decisions rather than question them. Arabella was cleaning the fireplace grate when they arrived. She stood and moved aside, and her uncle walked past her without looking. If with her face. She had not expected him to look. 17 months of visiting the house his brother built, and he had never once looked properly at the servants. That was not particular meanness. That was simply how some people moved through the world, registering only what registered as relevant. "This section of the house needs reorganizing," he said to the estate manager. "I want the records from the last 30 years consolidated into the north storage and everything else disposed of." Arabella did not move. She stood at the periphery of the room with her cleaning cloth and her expression of competent neutrality, and she listened to her uncle instruct his man to destroy 30 years of evidence. She had expected this, too. She had already copied everything she needed. But the instruction itself was useful. It was the kind of instruction that became very interesting when submitted to a court as part of a document record. She made a mental note. She went back to the fireplace. Her uncle left without having registered her existence in any specific way. That was fine. That was, in fact, exactly what she had needed. She had been at Thornfield for 7 months when she first encountered the Duke of Morecambe. She had known of him in the general way one knows of people who occupy the adjacent county and appear at the same social events. Oliver Stanton, the Duke of Morecambe, 43 years old, widowed 6 years ago, a man of considerable reputation in land management and agricultural matters, quiet by the standards of his rank. She had met him twice in her previous life, at large gatherings where he had been precisely as unremarkable as the gatherings deserved. She had not thought of him particularly in the intervening years. He appeared at the edge of the Thornfield kitchen garden on a Tuesday morning in November, with an expression of mild surprise, as though he had arrived somewhere slightly different from where he had intended, and was revising his expectations accordingly. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I was looking for the estate office. I have an appointment with Viscount Harwell regarding the boundary dispute along the north field. The footman directed me through the garden, which I now suspect was a misunderstanding. He was speaking to her as a housekeeper. She was wearing a housekeeper's apron and holding a basket of dried herbs, so this was entirely reasonable. Something about this specific fact, that he was addressing her with the same direct courtesy he would presumably extend to any person he was speaking to, without the slight downward adjustment that most people of his rank produced automatically in such situations, caught her attention. "The estate office is through the south entrance," she said. "If you continue along the path past the kitchen garden and turn left at the old oak, you'll see it directly." "Thank you." He looked at the herbs in her basket. "Thyme and rosemary for Mrs. Quine. Good cook." "Exceptional," Arabella said. And then, because the morning was quiet and something about the straightforward nature of the conversation felt like an unusual relief, "The rosemary needs cutting back. Half the kitchen herbs have been neglected since the change of management." She had not intended to say that last part. It was more specific than a housekeeper should comfortably offer to a visiting duke. She was out of practice with being careful in the mornings. The mornings at Thornfield were when she was most herself. He looked at her for a moment. Not, she thought, with recognition. They had met only twice, years ago, at crowded events, and she was wearing different clothes and different expectations. But with something. "Change of management," he repeated in the tone of a man noting something for later consideration. "I should be getting back," Arabella said pleasantly, and she went. She did not think about the Duke of Morecombe again that day. She had a great deal of other things to think about. Mr. Finch came to Thornfield on the following Friday. He came as her uncle's solicitor was expected to come, under the guise of a routine query about the estate accounts, which he had arranged through channels that Arabella had preferred not to examine. He was in his 70s, with the dry precision of a man who has spent 50 years ensuring that words mean exactly what they say, and he sat in the East Wing study, the room that had been her father's office and was now her cleaning territory, and spread documents across the table with the same unhurried confidence Arabella had been trying to cultivate in herself. "The financial evidence is strong," he said. "The handwriting inconsistencies in the transfer authorizations are documentable. I have engaged a specialist who has reviewed the originals, Dr. Calloway and Dr. Calloway. He has provided a sworn statement. He was present when 3 documents were placed before your father for signature in the final week of his life. He states that your father was not lucid enough to have understood their content. He states that your uncle was present at each signing and that no independent witness was invited." Mr. Finch adjusted his spectacles. "He also states that he raised this concern at the time and was informed by Viscount Harwell that it was a family matter." Arabella looked out the window at the kitchen garden. The thyme she had trimmed on Tuesday was already looking marginally better. "When?" she asked. "The formal petition can be lodged within the month. The court will require a hearing. These things take time." He paused. "You should be prepared for your uncle to become aware of the proceedings before the hearing. He will have notice. I know. He will attempt to manage the situation. I know that too." Mr. Finch looked at her over his spectacles. He had a particular expression he deployed when he was about to say something he considered important. She had learned to recognize it. "You have conducted yourself with considerable skill in a situation that required a great deal of patience," he said. "I want to be clear that the outcome is not certain. It is likely. It is not certain." "Nothing worth having is certain," Arabella said. "I learned that early." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his bag and produced another folder, thicker than the first. "There is also the matter of the boundary dispute with the Duke of Morecombe," he said, "which your uncle has been managing rather poorly. The Duke's claim appears on review to be entirely sound." Arabella looked at the folder. "I see," she said, and picked up her pen. Her uncle's solicitor arrived at Thornfield 3 days later. With a summons and an expression of controlled alarm, she was informed of his arrival by the footman, who found her cleaning the upper landing with the particular thoroughness she applied to areas of the house she was fond of. She set down her cloth, smoothed her apron, and went down to the kitchen to make herself a cup of tea because there was no reason. Her uncle arrived himself the following morning. He arrived as men like him always arrived when something had gone wrong. Without notice, carrying the energy of a man who expects that his presence alone will resolve matters. He found the Thornfield household proceeding in a state of organized calm, Mrs. Quine directing the daily work with her customary efficiency, and his housekeeper, Miss Beatrice Marsh, trimming a lamp in the entrance hall. He walked past her. He went to the drawing room. He demanded the estate manager. Arabella set the lamp back in its place, put away the trimming scissors, and went to stand outside the drawing room door. She listened for 7 minutes. She heard her uncle's voice, raised, working through his options out loud. Deny the petition. Discredit Mr. Finch, have the court delay proceedings, apply pressure through the county. All the moves of a man accustomed to operating through influence rather than evidence. Then she knocked. Yes, her uncle's voice, sharp. She opened the door. She stepped inside. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she removed the cap from her head and said, "Good morning, Uncle. I think we should talk." He stared at her. The estate manager stared at her. In the silence that followed, which was quite long, the clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily on, indifferent to the particular texture of the moment. "Arabella," her uncle said finally. His voice had shifted into something she had not heard from him before, something cautious. "I've been here for 7 months," she said pleasantly. "The East Wing records are in excellent order. I can show you, if you'd like." She did not feel triumphant. She had expected to feel something sharper, satisfaction perhaps, or anger finally finding its proper expression. What she felt instead was something much quieter, clear. She felt clear, the way a window feels after rain, when everything on the other side of it becomes suddenly legible. Her uncle sat down without having been invited to. He looked, for the first time in her memory, like a man who did not know what to do with his hands. "The court petition has been lodged," she said, sitting across from him with the composure she had spent 7 months assembling like furniture for a room she had always intended to inhabit. "Mr. Finch represents the petitioner. You will receive formal notice today or tomorrow. I wanted to tell you myself in this house, because this is my house, and I have spent sufficient time in it recently to understand it rather better than I had previously." Her uncle found his voice. "This is extraordinary." "Yes," she agreed. You have been working here as a servant, as a housekeeper. Mrs. Quine has been extraordinarily kind." Arabella glanced toward the door, where she was reasonably certain Mrs. Quine was listening. "The East Wing in particular has benefited from my attention. The records are copied," she said. "Every document from the relevant period. They are with Mr. Finch, and they are also with a second solicitor in Edinburgh in the event that anything happens to the originals." She let that sit for a moment. "I understand you have given instructions to consolidate and dispose of them. I thought you should know that the consolidation has, in a sense, already occurred." Her uncle looked at her. His jaw moved. Something that might have been respect, if it had been a different person in a different situation, moved briefly across his face and was replaced by calculation. "What do you want?" he said. It was the question she had been waiting for, not because she had not known the answer. She had known the answer for 3 years. But because the question, asked in that precise way, from that position, in this room, meant something. It meant he was already thinking about negotiation rather than continued resistance. It meant he knew or had begun to know how this was likely to conclude. "I want what has always been mine," she said. "Thornfield, the accounts, the management of the estate restored to the terms of my father's original will, which Mr. Finch has a certified copy of as it stood before your revisions. I want my name on the deed as it was meant to be. I want the transfers from the estate accounts over the last 14 months documented and reviewed by an independent assessor. And if I contest the petition, then we proceed through the courts," Arabella said evenly. "With the financial records, Dr. Calloway's testimony, and the handwriting analysis of the transfer authorizations. The evidence is substantial. The outcome is, Mr. Finch tells me, likely." She paused. "I would prefer not to do it that way. It will take 2 years and it will cost both of us considerably. But I will do it if you require it of me. I have time." She was 26 years old. He was 53. That was also something. Her uncle was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a wood pigeon was conducting some business in the garden. The fire crackled. "I will need to consult my own solicitor," he said at last. "Of course," she said pleasantly. "I'll have Mrs. Quine bring tea." He was in the drive, waiting for his carriage, when the Duke of Morecambe arrived for his rescheduled appointment about the boundary dispute. The two men acknowledged each other in the particular way of men who have business on opposite sides of a matter. Not warmly, not coldly, with the calibrated neutrality of people who understand that they are likely to be in the same room a great deal in the near future and would prefer not to have said anything they will have cause to regret. The Duke looked at the carriage being called round. He looked at the house. Then he looked at Arabella, who was standing on the steps in her housekeeper's dress, which she had not yet had occasion to change. She saw the moment he placed her. Not fully, not all of it, but something shifted in his expression. The adjustment of a man reconciling two separate images of the same person and finding the reconciliation more interesting than he had anticipated. "Miss Marsh," he said. "My name is Arabella Thornton," she said. "I apologize for the earlier misdirection. I was otherwise occupied at the time." He looked at her for a moment. His expression did not go where she expected. It did not go to surprise, or judgment, or the subtle recalibration that most people produced when discovering that the person they had been speaking to was someone other than who they appeared. It went, instead, somewhere she had not seen on a face in quite a long time. Something that might, in the right light, be called interest. Not the social interest of a man who has just learned he is speaking to an heiress, but something else. The interest of a man who has been shown something unexpected and finds it genuinely compelling rather than merely convenient. "The time," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon." "You said the kitchen herbs had been neglected since the change of management. I thought that was a peculiar thing for a housekeeper to know, or to say to someone she'd just met." He tilted his head slightly. "I'd been wondering about it." Arabella looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her chest, not dramatic, not the sudden upheaval of a changed situation, but something smaller and more precise, the particular sensation of being noticed by someone who was paying actual attention. "Would you like to see the estate?" she said. "Since you're here for the boundary question, I know the North Field rather well. I walked it regularly as a child." He offered his arm. She did not take it. They were not there yet, and she was still wearing an apron. But she walked beside him into the garden, and they discussed the boundary between the Thornfield and Morecambe properties with the kind of specific and practical attention that both of them, she discovered, genuinely preferred to social performance. He knew the land. He knew it the way she was beginning to understand was characteristic of him, all the way down, without exaggeration. He asked questions and then listened to the answers with real attention, and when she described the drainage problem along the North Field's eastern edge that had been causing disputes between the estates for 30 years, he said, That can be resolved. It's a straightforward matter of redirecting the seasonal flow. I had it suggested to your uncle twice, and he declined to engage with it. My uncle is not good with straightforward matters, Arabella said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, the precondition of one. No, the Duke of Morecambe said. I gathered that. The formal petition took 4 months to work through the court. Her uncle contested it once, half-heartedly, withdrew his contest in the 3rd month, and signed the settlement in the 4th. Mr. Finch described the outcome in a letter that was 3 sentences long and characteristically exact. The original will had been restored, the estate restored to Arabella Thornton as rightful heir, and the financial transfers from the preceding years had been assessed and were subject to a separate repayment arrangement that her uncle's solicitor had proposed, and which Mr. Finch found acceptable. Arabella read the letter at the desk in the East Wing study, which was now simply her study. She set it down. She looked at the window, at the kitchen garden where the thyme and rosemary were doing considerably better than they had in October. She was not a wealthy woman by the standards of the peerage. Thornfield was not a grand estate. It was a working one, the kind that required attention and honest management, the kind that her father had loved precisely because it was real. She was also not, as she had feared in the months of waiting, ruined. The accounts, once cleaned up, were sound. The estate, once the neglect of the past 3 years was addressed, was productive. She was, in fact, something she had not been in 3 years, in possession of herself. She picked up her pen. She wrote a letter to Mrs. Quine, which was brief and probably redundant, since Mrs. Quine already knew everything, thanking her for her particular kindness in the East Wing. She wrote a letter to Mr. Finch which took longer and said more, and then she walked out into the kitchen garden and stood for a while in the November morning, doing nothing except being in her own house for the first time in 3 years without pretending to be someone else. The garden was cold and a little bare and rather badly in need of attention, and it was magnificent. Oliver Stanton arrived on a Wednesday, which was becoming their habit without either of them having remarked on it. And he came, ostensibly, about the Northfield drainage proposal, which they had discussed twice over the preceding months, and which Arabella had approved in principle subject to a survey she was waiting to receive. He came in the way he did everything. Without ceremony, without advance performance, with the unaffected directness of someone whose presence required no announcement. She met him in the drive in her own clothes, which still felt slightly like a costume, because 3 years of other people's expectations do not vanish in 4 months, but which were getting easier. "The survey came yesterday," she said. "You were right about the seasonal flow. It's a 2-season fix at most." "I thought so." He looked at the house. It was a clear day, and Thornfield in the morning light was, as it had always been, quietly lovely. Not grand, not imposing, but deeply itself in the way that only honest houses managed. "How does it feel?" She considered the question the way she had been learning to consider things. Not the automatic deflection of 3 years of careful self-management, but the real answer found by actually looking. Like coming back from a very long journey to find the house has been used carelessly in your absence, she said, and also discovering that most of what matters is still there and can be repaired. He looked at her. "The rosemary, thriving," she said. Mrs. Quine is inordinately pleased. Something moved in his expression, that precondition of a smile, arriving a degree closer to the actual thing. "Would you walk the Northfield with me?" he said. "I'd like to show you where I propose to start the drainage work." And then he stopped. He was not, she had come to understand, a man who stopped often. "I find I have been wanting to ask you something that is not about drainage." She looked at him. The morning was cold and the garden was imperfect, and she was still wearing the slightly wrong shoes for walking a muddy field, and she had approximately 11 things on her desk that required attention today. "Ask me," she said. He told her that he had thought about the conversation in the kitchen garden in November more than was entirely rational. He told her that he had managed to talk himself into various professional justifications for the frequency of his visits, and that he had stopped believing those justifications somewhere around the 3rd week of February. He told her that he was not asking for anything she was not in a position to give, that he understood her situation was newly settled and her ground newly recovered, and that he had no interest in complicating either. What he was asking, he said, with the direct plainness that she had found from the first morning more refreshing than she had known how to say at the time, was whether she might consider allowing him to call with something more honest than drainage surveys. Arabella looked at him for a long moment. Outside the kitchen garden, the north field stretched away toward the boundary hedge, the one that had been argued over for 30 years and that 2 seasons of honest work could actually fix. "Yes," she said. "On those terms, yes. I would like that." Something settled in his face. Not a performance of relief, the real thing. "Thank you for asking properly," she said. "It seemed the right approach," he said. "For someone who has had enough of people arranging things without her permission." She laughed. It was not the careful, social laugh she had deployed for years in drawing rooms. The laugh that confirmed other people's meaning without committing to any particular feeling. It came from somewhere unguarded, and it surprised her with how complete it felt. There was a gathering of the county families at midsummer, the kind of event that served as both reunion and verdict. Who was where, what had changed, who had arrived, and who had departed the particular stage of local significance. Arabella attended because Thornfield made it appropriate, and because she was not, she had discovered, afraid of rooms full of people who knew her history. She had been afraid for a long time. That had been one of the uses of the gray dress and the borrowed cap. Not just practical cover, but a version of herself who could not be hurt by the room's opinion because she was not there officially to receive it. She was there officially now. She wore green because green suited her and because it was not the muted colors of a woman making herself smaller. She wore her mother's earrings, which she had not worn in 3 years, which were hers and had always been hers. Her uncle was in the room. He was standing near the window with the expression of a man who has made a reckoning and is managing it with what dignity he can arrange. They had exchanged letters since the settlement. The letters to extend anything further. She had no desire to extend anything further, and nor, it seemed, did he. She acknowledged him when their paths crossed, as one acknowledges a person with whom one has a complicated history and a settled account, directly, without performance, without warmth beyond what courtesy required. "Arabella," he said. "Uncle." She looked at him for a moment. He looked older. Something had gone out of him. Not the whole of it. Not enough to make her feel anything as generous as pity, but something. The particular certainty of a man who has spent his life arranging things and has encountered something that could not be arranged. "I hope you are well." "I am managing," he said, which was, she supposed, accurate. She moved on. Oliver Stanton arrived late, which was unusual for him. She saw him from across the room in the way she had begun to see him from across rooms, without looking, with the particular peripheral awareness of someone whose presence you have started to treat as a point of orientation. He found her without difficulty. He stopped beside her. "How is it?" he said. "Fine," she said. "Better than that." She looked at him. He looked older. "Men often do," he said, "when the things they've built on other people's ground turn out not to hold." She considered that. The Northfield survey came in this morning. The assessor's recommendations are almost exactly what you said. I have been walking that boundary for 6 years. I have had time to think about it. You were right about the seasonal drainage. I was also right, he said. that it would take someone with a stake in the actual outcome to approve it. She looked at him. The room moved around them in its particular fashion, performing itself for itself, and they stood in the middle of it being something other than performance. "Come to Thornfield on Thursday," she said. "I want to begin the north field work before the ground hardens. And I want," she considered the words, "I want your opinion on the west orchard. The trees there have been poorly managed for 3 years, and I am told they can be saved, but I want someone with better judgment than mine about what exactly that will require." He looked at her in the particular way that she was learning to receive without deflecting. Not at the heiress. Not at the woman who had disguised herself as a housekeeper and then produced documentation that upended an inheritance. At her? At Arabella, at the specific and exact person who was standing here asking about apple trees and meaning something more than apple trees. "Thursday," he said. She nodded. They both understood what they were doing. They had been understanding it for some time, which was, she was finding, its own kind of pleasure. The pleasure of something developing honestly, without being rushed into the shape of someone else's expectation. The west orchard at Thornfield was, he told her on Thursday morning, not as far gone as she had feared. She had feared it. She had walked it in her first weeks at Thornfield in October, while ostensibly collecting fallen fruit for Mrs. Quine, and she had stood among the neglected trees, and felt something complicated about the state of them, about the fact that 3 years of inattention could do this to something her father had tended with such care. "This one," Oliver said, indicating a tree at the corner whose bark she had last seen split and gray, "is sounder than it looks. The root system is intact. What it needs is cutting back and time." "Cut back and given time," she repeated. "That's generally how it goes." He looked at her. She had come to understand, a way of saying impractical things that carried other meaning without straining for it. It was one of the things she liked best about him. The orchard was cold and still and imperfect, and she stood in the middle of it, and she thought about 3 years of other people's arrangements, and 7 months of a gray dress and a borrowed cap, and about what it felt like to be standing here now in her own coat on her own land, beside a man who asked real questions. "I have a question for you," she said. "Ask it." She asked it. What she asked was this: whether he had ever considered what it meant to build something alongside someone, rather than for them or despite them. Whether he thought that was a thing that could be arranged honestly between two people who both understood the value of ground that was genuinely their own. He was quiet for a moment. The wind came through the orchard and moved the bare branches. "I think it can be arranged," he said, "if both people mean it." "I mean it," she said. "I know," he said. "I have known for some time. I was waiting for you to be ready to say it." She looked at him. "How long have you been waiting?" "Since the kitchen garden," he said. "The time, I thought then. Here is a woman who is paying very close attention to something. I wanted to know what it was." "It was my house," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know that now. And I think you should know that whatever the drainage surveys and the boundary disputes have been in practice, in intention, they have been an excuse to come back and find out what happened next." Arabella Thornton stood in her own west orchard on a cold Thursday morning, with the imperfect trees and the good soil and the man who had walked the north field boundary for 6 years and known it was worth fixing, and she said, "Come to dinner on Saturday. Properly. Tell me everything you know about orchards, and I will tell you everything I know about East Wing household records, and we will see what we can make of it." He came on Saturday, and then he came again. The dinners were simple and long and full of the particular quality of conversation between two people who are being honest about what they are doing, which is its own form of intimacy, and which feels, Arabella discovered, like finally breathing properly after a very long time of being careful about air. She signed the deed of Thornfield in her own name in the spring. She stood on the steps of Mr. Finch's office in the village on a bright April morning and held the document in her hands and read her own name on it. Arabella Margaret Thornton, and felt something she had not known how to feel in 3 years, in 3 Not triumph, not relief, complete. She felt complete, the way the house felt when the fires were lit in all the rooms and every door was open. Mrs. Quine to Thornfield. Mrs. Quine had made a cake. The kitchen herbs were in better condition than they had been in years. The west orchard, where the work had begun in January, was already showing the particular readiness of things that have been properly tended and given time. The corner tree, the one that had looked, against all reasonable expectation, entirely worth saving, was showing the first green thickening at its ebb and souffle that precedes everything. She had told a young cousin, one of the younger generation of the family, who had written her a careful letter after the settlement, expressing something between apology and solidarity, that the process had been harder than she had anticipated and better than she had imagined, which was the honest way to describe it. She had not told the cousin about the gray dress and the borrowed cap, because those details belonged to a chapter that she was no longer required to live in, but did not intend to be ashamed of. She had been very good at cleaning the east wing. It was an honest thing to have done. She sat at the desk in her study, not the east wing study now. She had moved her work to the room her father had used, the one with the better light and the view of the front drive. And she looked out at the west orchard and thought about what she would say if someone asked her to account for the past 3 years. She would say this: she had not gone back into her own house as a servant in order to punish anyone. She had done it because it was the most direct route to the truth, and the truth was what she had needed, and she had not trusted anyone else to go and get it for her. She would say, it took patience. It took a great deal of patience, and an excellent solicitor, and a housekeeper who understood something she never stated directly, and a doctor in a village 12 miles away who had been carrying a thing too long and was relieved to set it down. And she would say, it turned out that the house was worth it. The house and the orchard, and the specific and irreplaceable satisfaction of sitting at her own desk in the room with the good light, watching the trees come back. Outside, the drive was quiet. The orchard was waking. Spring was 3 weeks away, and the corner tree, the one that had looked beyond saving and wasn't, was going to bloom first. She picked up her pen and got back to work.